All right, well, we're going to talk a little bit about covenants today, and the Spring Bible Study was really a great experience. I didn't feel like I was qualified to go to that, but I still had a good time, and it's like drinking from a fire hose, the amount of information that was shared there. And it really improved my understanding of the importance of covenants. Generally, we don't think of covenants very much. Covenants is not a word that we use in our day-to-day vocabulary, although covenant is a common word that's used in legal vocabulary. So if you have like marriage covenant or a property or deed or something like that, it's a real common word there. But it's in day-to-day conversation, we don't do it. And in most teachings about the Bible, you don't hear much about covenants. But covenants are, turns out, a very important part of trying to understand the Bible and understand our relationship to God through these different covenants. And there are 6 God to man covenants that we're going to ultimately get into. And so just as an overview of what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about what's in a covenant, kind of language is used when God talks about covenants and when other people talk about covenants in the Bible, because covenant is a common word in the Bible, not just regarding the 6 covenants of God to man, but there's lots of covenants between men and they're mentioned in the Bible. We'll talk about phrases that are used in covenantology, and pledges and gifts and signs are all things that are exchanged and happen to mark or show the significance or intent of covenant. We're going to look at the phrase cut a covenant. That's the most common term that's used throughout the Bible. And we're going to talk about the story of Beersheba. That's a little bit of a sidebar, but Beersheba, turns out, I didn't really recognize how important Beersheba was, but it helped me to understand a lot of Bible events. And Beersheba, the word itself, means well of the oath or well of the 7 sheep, or if you give me a little flexibility, well of the covenant. And we're going to see about Abraham's covenant that occurred at Beersheba. And then we're going to ultimately get into the first and maybe the second of the God to man covenants, the Noahic covenant and the priestly covenant. And I'll just mention that, so those are the Noahic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, the priestly covenant, the Mosaic covenant, the Davidic covenant, and the new covenant are the 6 covenants that are important to understand in the Bible. So what is a covenant? So a covenant is just an agreement between 2 individuals or 2 parties. That's all it is. Some people think of it as a contract, but it's really not exactly the same thing as a contract. It's kind of more informal than that. And it's about doing or not doing a specific thing. It's a legally binding obligation. And a covenant can be between equal parties, like the covenant of marriage, or the covenant can be between unequal parties, like a king and his subjects, or God and man. So those are unequal parties. Equal party covenants are usually voluntary. They're like a partnership. They're negotiated in business into or at the place where there's covenants. Unequal covenants are when you have a superior party having a relationship with a subordinate party. God toward men, king toward vassals. A vassal is just a subject of the king. And those types of covenants are usually, when you have a superior party and an inferior party, they're usually not negotiated. It's God just states what the covenant's going to be, or the king states what the covenant's going to be. And in those types of covenants, people who study this a lot break them into 2 major types of covenants: a grant covenant and a treaty covenant. In a grant covenant, God establishes the covenant, or he grants it. And let me have you turn to Genesis chapter 6, verse 17. And we're going to get to this again in a little bit later when we get to the Noahic covenant and Noahic covenant. But this is the first usage of covenant in the Bible. And I'll start in verse 17. I, even I, am bringing a flood of water on this earth to destroy from under the heavens all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth will die, but I will establish my covenant with you. You are to come into the ship, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And so that is the first mention of a covenant in the Bible, and it's the beginning of, it's the Noahic covenant that God is talking about at that time. So in this type of a covenant, God alone is obligated to keep the tenets of the covenant. So that's a grant covenant. The second type of covenant is a treaty covenant, and the treaty is an obligation of the vassal to the master, or man to God. The Mosaic covenant is an example of a treaty covenant. And to give some further depth of understanding of these two types of covenant, there's a table in some of the literature about covenants that describes ancient Near East covenants. Now, these are covenants between some of the old countries and civilizations and stuff of the ancient life, and these were between kings and other kings and subjects and things like that. So under a grant covenant, the giver of the covenant makes a commitment to the vassal. I remember grant covenants are like the Noahic covenant and the Abrahamic covenant, where the giver of the covenant makes a commitment to the vassal. The covenant represents an obligation of the master to the vassal. The covenant primarily protects the rights of the vassal, and no demands are made by the superior party. This is just simply something that the superior party grants to the inferior party. In a treaty, the giver of the covenant imposes an obligation on the vassal. Like a king tells his subjects, this is what you can do. The representative and the treaty covenant represents an obligation of the vassal to his master. And a treaty covenant primarily protects the rights of the master. And the master promises to reward or punish the vassal for obeying or disobeying the imposed obligations. So now, the covenants of God don't exactly match all these things, but it's an educational thing about what ancient Near East covenants are about. So, some of the languages and things, or some of the parts of a covenant that we have to pay attention to, are the phrases that are used to talk about a covenant, like we already saw, the phrase that God said, I will establish a covenant, pledges, and signs. So pledges often involve gifts or oaths to indicate that you really mean it. So a gift, if you have a deal with somebody, or somebody makes a covenant with you, they may give you a present of some kind to demonstrate their sincerity and their meaning of the covenant, or they may swear an oath. May lightning strike me if I don't do what I say I'm going to do, or may God strike me dead, if I don't do what I say I'm going to do. So those are kind of oaths and things like that. Signs are given, and we're going to go over the rainbow. That's the obvious one in the Noahic covenant. But signs are given for remembrance. So covenants are supposed to be remembered. And so many times a sign is given of some kind, like circumcision in the Mosaic covenant and rainbow in the Noahic covenant. But signs are given to be remembered, something that persists after the covenant is agreed to. And some of the phraseology that goes is to establish a covenant, or make a covenant, or to cut a covenant. To cut a covenant is the most common usage that covenants are used for, although the cut only applies to certain covenants. So, and it refers to the ratification ceremony in what's called a blood covenant. And the ratification ceremony is where animals are sacrificed. They're cut in half. Half of the animal is put on one side, left side, and the other half is put on the right side. And then the two parties walk between these pieces of the animals, symbolically saying, if I don't live up to the covenant, may the same thing happen to me. So it is an example of where a blood covenant or a cutting the covenant occurs. So let me have you go then to Genesis chapter 15, and we'll see an example of a blood covenant in the Bible. And this is a part of the Abrahamic covenant, which we're going to get into at a future date. And we're going to go to verse 7. Now, just to put things in perspective of when these things happened, Noah was about 2300 BC, the flood was. Abraham is in the middle from creation to Christ, for the birth of Christ. So Abraham was about 2000 BC. David was halfway between Abraham and Christ. That's about 1000 BC. Then the Mosaic covenant was about halfway between Abraham and David, so around 1450 BC. Okay, so so the blood covenant is about 2000 BC. God had called Abraham originally from the Mesopotamian area to leave his family, and he shows up, and God calls him out and is establishing this covenant. And so in verse 7, he says, God said to him, I am Yahweh who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to possess it. He said, Lord Yahweh, how will I know that I will possess it? And God said to him, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. So there's a heifer, a goat, and a ram, and 2 birds, a turtle dove and a pigeon. So he, Abraham, brought him all these and cut them down the middle and laid each half opposite the others. But he did not divide the birds. The birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. When the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abraham. And behold, terror and great darkness fell on him. Now, this deep sleep, this is a God-induced deep sleep. Some translations describe a trance, but it's not Abraham falling asleep. So to me, it's a spatial state that God induces that allows Abraham to be aware of what's going on and to see things and to remember things. Because if he was in a deep sleep, then he wouldn't remember anything. And then in verse 17, it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. In that day, Yahweh cut a covenant with Abram. Now, typically in the ceremony ratifying the covenant, both parties walk between the animals. But in this ceremony, only God, represented by the flaming torch and the smoking firepot, walks between the animals. And this is a ratification of the covenant which God is making with Abraham that we'll get into at a later date. But this is just to show the ratification ceremony. So another example for covenants are gifts and things that people share with one another. And so let me have you go to 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17. And we'll go down.
Can I ask a question before you keep going?
Yeah, fire away, yeah.
What is the significance of the walking between these animals? What is this? I understand that it's ratifying the covenant, but what is the symbolism of walking between them?
So the only depth of knowledge I have about that is what I had mentioned before, is that so if it was 2 people, as you're walking between the animals, you're seeing these sacrificed animals, and you're making the commitment that if I break the covenant, then I ask God to do the same thing to me as happened to these animals, that the animals were killed. Or I'll give up my life rather than give up compliance to the covenant.
Okay.
It's a symbolic thing because, of course, God can't give up his life, but it's a symbolic thing. So, okay. So in 1 Samuel, so this is a covenant between David and Jonathan. All right. And so David This is right at the very beginning. David is a young boy, and he had just gotten done with the thing with Goliath. And so in verse 57, as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, that was Goliath, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, you young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite." And keep going in chapter 18, verse 1. It came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking to Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan and David cut a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, his fighting attire, even to his sword and to his bow and to his belt. So Jonathan gave David the robe, the fighting attire, the sword, the bow, and the belt as a symbolic gift to show the importance of the covenant that they struck together. David went out, in verse 5, David went out wherever Saul sent him and was successful, and Saul set him over the men of war, and it was good in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. So that's an example of gifts as a part of the commitment to the covenant. So a couple more examples of that are in the story about Beersheba. I'm going to see if I can put this map on here without screwing things up. So can you see a map of Israel there?
Yep.
Showing up. So if you look in southern Israel, there's this little town. Can you see my pointer?
Yep.
A town called Beersheba. And you know look where Beersheba is. Here's the Negev Desert, and this is modern Israel. This is not ancient Israel. Here's the Negev Desert. Here is Jerusalem up in here. Here's the Dead Sea. Okay. Here is Palestine, the West Bank, where you'll be able to spend some time there on your trip with John, and you'll see all of this. So Beersheba is known, as the southern extent of Israel, and there was an old saying, from Dan to Beersheba. So Dan is the northern extent, and Beersheba is the southern extent, which would encompass the whole of Israel. And then I'll show you another map here. This is a map of an ancient map of the same place, and it gives you an idea of where Beersheba is. Dead Sea, here's Gomorrah and Sodom, Mediterranean Sea. Jerusalem was up in here. And this also has where the different pagan tribes lived: the Canaanites, the Hivites, Philistines, Amorites, Moabites, where they lived in around this area. So let me have you turn to Genesis chapter 20. This is the first event that I want to share about Beersheba. The word Beersheba, the beer part of it means well, and Shiva or Sheba either means seven or oath. So it's the well of the seven or well of the oath is what Beersheba means, and we're going to understand a little bit more where that comes from. So in Genesis chapter 20, and we'll start with verse 1. So Abraham had just been in the region of Sodom and Gomorrah, because they just had the story before this that I'm going to read happened was the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot and all that stuff. And so Abraham goes over here to this area where the Philistines live. And it says, Abraham traveled from there, there is where Sodom and Gomorrah was, toward the region of the Negev, and lived between Kadesh and Shur. Those aren't on there. While temporarily staying in Gerar. So Gerar is on there, over here. Abraham said about Sarah, his wife, she is my sister. So Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. This is the story where Abraham, now you know, Abraham actually was Sarah's sister. Abraham and Sarah had the same father but different mothers. But anyway, in that culture, so Abraham's in a foreign land. The king, if you were a beautiful woman, didn't matter. The king would just take you to be part of his entourage. And if you were married, they'd just kill the husband and take you. And so Abraham was afraid that that was going to happen to him, so they did this ruse on Abimelech. But God, in verse 3, but God came to Abimelech in a dream of that night and said to him, behold, you are a dead man because the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. And so anyway, so all that goes on, and Abimelech realizes that he made a big screw up and that God was going to get him. And so in verse 14, Abimelech took sheep and cattle, male slaves and female slaves, and gave them to Abraham and returned Sarah, his wife, to him. Abimelech, Gabe caught me. Abimelech is not necessarily the name of the king, but it could be a title of the king because there's multiple Abimelechs. And it's like Caesar would be. And I was thinking, you know, like in the popes take a different name, where you have Pope John the 23rd, there are 23 Johns. So Abimelech may be doing that too. I don't know. But anyway, Abimelech said, behold, my land is before you. Wherever it seems good in your eyes, live there. So what is his land? His land is, you know, this land in here, where the Philistines are, where he's the king. And to Sarah he said, behold, in verse 11, or verse 16, behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Behold, it is for you a covering of the eyes to all that are with you. In front of all, you are vindicated. So it was as if his abduction of Sarah never happened, as far as, you know, he paid the price. Then in verse 17, then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and his female slaves so that they could bear children. For Yahweh had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. So that was the first thing that happened around Beersheba. The second thing in chapter 21 is the birth of Isaac. I'm not going to read that. And then in chapter 21, verse 8, second part of chapter 21, is the weaning of Isaac, and when Ishmael and Hagar were sent away. And I'll read in verse 8, the child grew and was weaned. That was Isaac. Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, that was Ishmael, of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking. So Ishmael was mocking the weaning of Isaac feast. And so she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman and her son, for the son of this slave woman will not be heir with my son Isaac. So then go down to verse 14. I'll just skip over some of the intervening story there. Abraham rose up early in the morning and took bread and a skin bottle of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, and gave her the child and sent her away. She departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. So another thing that happened at Beersheba. The fourth thing that happened there was the Abraham's covenant with Abimelech. And if you go down to chapter 21, verse 22, and this includes the controversy over Abraham's well. And wells, of course, at that time were very, very important. Abraham had a lot of livestock and he needed water. And so water rights was a really big deal in wherever you were. And so it came to pass in verse 22, at that time that Abimelech and Phicol, the captain of his army, spoke to Abraham, saying, God is with you in all that you do. So now swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me, nor with my son, nor with my son's son. Rather, according to the kindness that I have done to you, you will do to me, and to the land where you have lived as a foreigner. So that refers back to the original place where Abimelech said, just look around, stay where you want, I like you, stick around. And in verse 24, Abraham said, I will swear. But Abraham complained to Abimelech because of a water well that Abimelech's servants had seized by force. So Abraham had dug a well and was using it, but Abimelech's people, soldiers and stuff, had confiscated the well, and Abraham says, hey, I need this well. And Abimelech said, verse 26, I do not know who has done this thing. You didn't tell me, nor have I heard about it until today. Well, maybe. So maybe Abimelech hadn't heard about it, but anyway, he hears about it now. So in 27, Abraham took sheep and cattle and gave them to Abimelech, and the two of them cut a covenant. Then Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart by themselves. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what did these 7 ewe lambs that you have set by themselves mean? He said, you should accept these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, so that it may be a witness for me that I have dug this well. So that's a pledge, a gift, something for that Abraham is doing to seal this covenant. And again, we see that where the name Beersheba comes from, because Abraham gave 7 ewe lambs to Abimelech. And Beersheba means well of the 7 or well of the oath. So in 31, so he called that place Beersheba because the two of them swore an oath there. So they cut a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech rose up with Phicol, the captain of his army, and they returned into the land of the Philistines. And then in verse 33, Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba. And there he called on the name of Yahweh, the everlasting God. Abraham lived as a foreigner in the land of the Philistines many days. So the tamarisk tree is also part of this covenant and is a sign of the covenant. That whenever you would see the tamarisk tree, you would remember this covenant that Abimelech and Abraham pledged together. All right, then this continues on with things in Beersheba. We won't read a whole lot of them, but the next part in chapter 22 is the sacrifice of Isaac. So Abraham was living around this area of Beersheba, and then in verse 2 of chapter 22, God said, now take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go into the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will point out to you. So the land of Moriah, so if you look up here, is up here in Jerusalem. So Abraham is going to go from this area, Beersheba, and he's going to walk, and get up here to around Jerusalem. Well, we believe that the land of Moriah is where Mount Moriah was, and Mount Moriah is believed to be the Temple Mount. So, continuing on there in verse 3, so Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering and rose up and went to the place that God told him of. On the 3rd day, so it's about a 3-day hike, it's about 50 miles, 50 to 60 miles from Beersheba to Jerusalem. So on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place in the distance. So I won't go through all the things, but that was just to show you again, this is a lot of these Bible stories, these things all happen in the same location. I just thought they were in a cloud somewhere. I never really appreciated that. And then there's several other things that I'll just mention. In Genesis chapter 26, Isaac built an altar of the Lord at Beersheba, and he had a dispute with Philistines over the water. And this story is very, very similar to the Sarah and Abraham story, only it's with Rebekah, where Isaac claimed Rebekah was his sister, and they ended up making a covenant to get Rebekah back. And then the seventh thing is Jacob. This is where Jacob stole the birthright from his brother Esau while the family camped at Beersheba. And this is also where Jacob had the dream about the ladder reaching into heaven. And then the final one is when Jacob, when he is on his way to Egypt after the famine and all this kind of stuff, he stopped at Beersheba to offer a sacrifice to God, to the God of his father Isaac. God spoke to him in visions of the night and encouraged him on his journey. That's in Genesis chapter 46. So anyway, so those are all the things that happened at Beersheba. And just to kind of put that in perspective, is an important place as far as covenants is understand covenants. So we have seen the language of the covenant, cutting a covenant. We've seen the different phraseology, pledges, and signs, and those are kind of the basics of covenants. And now we're ready to move on to specific covenants. Now remember, there are six covenants, God to man covenants: the Noahic, Abrahamic, priestly, Mosaic, Davidic, and new. How do I get, oh, here we go, stop the share. Okay.
Real quick, Doug, I would
Yeah.
like to use that map, and I don't know where you got that map, as a Bible story for Little Roman, and that
Yeah.
would really speak to him, being
Just-
about 5. Can you email it to me, or could you tell me where to get it?
Just Google map of Israel.
Okay, but the way yours looks is a little different than what I've seen.
Well, it gives you several.
Okay.
You pick the one you like. So, okay. So we're going to talk first about the Noahic covenant. That's the first covenant and the first usage of the word covenant in the Bible. There's 3 elements of that suffer judgment in the flood that you need to kind of look for when we're getting to the covenant. And that's the judgment was for man, all flesh, and the earth. So those 3 things. So God's destruction of the world included man, all living things, and the earth itself was a part of the judgment. And it was God's intention to destroy the whole earth. So let's go to Genesis chapter 6, verse 17. And we'd read part of this earlier. So this is before the flood. In verse 17, chapter 6 of Genesis, God says, I, even I, am bringing a flood of water on this earth to destroy from under the heavens all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth will die. But I will establish my covenant with you. You are to come into the ship, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And some of every living thing, some of all flesh, you are to bring into the ship to keep them alive with you. Pairs of every kind. They are to be a male and a female. Of the birds according to their kind. Of the livestock according to their kind. Of every creeping thing of the ground after its kind. Pairs of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. Take with you some of all the food that is eaten and gather it to yourself, and it will be for food for you and for them. And Noah did this according to all that God commanded him, so he did. Now, God mentions the covenant in this passage, but he doesn't say what the covenant is. He just said, I'll establish a covenant with you, and then he asked Noah to do these things, and Noah did them. So then in Genesis chapter 8, so move down a chapter or 2. Genesis chapter 8, starting with verse 15. Now this is after the flood. So we're not getting into the details of all the flooding and stuff. But this is after the flood, and we're going to hear God's promise to Noah. So God spoke to Noah in verse 15, saying, Go out of the ship, you and your wife, and your sons wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh, including birds, livestock, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may breed abundantly in the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. Verse 18, Noah went out with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives with him. Verse 19, every animal, every creeping thing, and every bird, whatever moves on the earth according to their families, went out of the ship. So the first thing Noah does in verse 20 is build an altar to Yahweh, and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. Now remember, Noah really took, for the clean animals, he took 7 of each clean animal, rather than not killing the pair, but one of the two pair of the 2 animals. And then in verse 21, Yahweh smelled the pleasant aroma, and he said in his heart, this is the promise, I will not curse the ground anymore for man's sake, because the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Nor will I ever again strike every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night will not cease. So that's the promise. And also point out that there was a sacrifice that Noah made when he built his altar. Then in Genesis 9, continuing on, this is where the specific covenant is made. God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you will come upon every animal of the earth and on every bird of the heavens. Everything that the ground teems with and all the flesh of the sea are delivered into your hand. Every morning, or every moving thing that lives will be food for you. As the green herb, I have given everything to you. But flesh with its life, its blood, you must not eat. I will surely require your blood of your lives. At the hand of every animal, I will require it. At the hand of man, even at the hand of every man's brother, I will require the life of man. So this is, I'll read verse 6. Whoever sheds the blood of man, his blood will be shed by man, for God made man in his own image. So this section in here, 4, 5, and 6, really is the first hint of the law that's going to come about the respect of life. One of the things that I was taught about the reason for God's destruction of mankind was there was so much murdering and destruction and death. And so God is saying, first of all, these are like kosher rules, no meat that hasn't had the blood drained out. So animals weren't to be strangled or eaten with the blood. So the blood's to be drained out. And so, but flesh with its life, because blood was a symbolic of the life of the animal. And it says, and then he talks about the man's of life. So if you kill another person or an animal kills you, then that animal or the person is to be killed. And the explanation of that thing about the every animal I will require it in verse 5 was that if an animal like an ox gored a man under the Mosaic law, if an ox killed a man, then the ox was to be stoned. So it wasn't to punish the ox because the ox is dumb, but it's to symbolize to other men, to other people, the importance of the life of that man that died. Okay, so we'll move on now in verse 7. Be fruitful and multiply, increase abundantly in the earth, and multiply in it. God spoke to Noah and to his sons with him, saying, as for me, behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your offspring after you. So here's the covenant. And with every living soul that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every animal of the earth with you, of all that go out of the ship, even every animal of the earth. I will establish my covenant with you. All flesh will not be cut off any more by the waters of the flood, nor will there ever again be a flood to destroy the earth. So here's the covenant. And in verse 9, the first part of the covenant is with Noah and his offspring, which carries on to all mankind, right? Because Noah and his offspring were the only ones alive at that time. So the covenant, this is the unique thing about the Noahic covenant, is it is the widest of all covenants because it includes everybody. All humanity is included in the Noahic covenant. Then in verse 10, and with every living soul that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every animal of the earth with you. So the second part of the covenant is with every living thing. So not only just man and all mankind, but every living thing and every living thing afterwards. And then finally, I will establish my covenant with you. All flesh will not be cut off anymore by the waters of the flood, nor will there ever again be a flood to destroy the earth. So then the third part of the covenant is with the earth. So the earth itself was damaged and was severely harmed. And so the covenant says that to the earth that we're not going to do that anymore. All right, so that is the end of the covenant part. And then continuing on in verse 12, now we're going to get to the sign of the covenant. In verse 12, God said, "This is the token of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living soul that is with you for perpetual generations. I set my rainbow in the cloud, and it will be for a sign of a covenant between me and the earth." So many assume that that this is the first time that there ever was a rainbow, that before this had rained or whatever, and that this is the first time it was a rainbow. But it doesn't say that this was the first time there was a rainbow. I'm just saying that this is a possibility. It may be that this is the time that God uses the rainbow as a covenant connection, a sign of the covenant. Okay? So it doesn't have to be that this was the very first rainbow. In verse 14, it will happen when I bring a cloud over the earth that the rainbow will be seen in the cloud. Remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living soul of all flesh, and the waters will no more become a flood to destroy all flesh. The rainbow will be in the cloud. I will look at it that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living soul of all flesh that is on the earth. So this is an everlasting covenant. So it goes from that day until the earth is destroyed by fire. So it goes through all the other covenants. It goes through Abrahamic covenant, Mosaic covenant, priestly covenant, and the new covenant, and the millennial kingdom, all the way up to the millennial kingdom, all the way up to the destruction of the earth. Okay, so that ends the, let me get that to verse 17. God said to Noah, "This is the token of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." So that's the Noahic covenant. Any questions about that?
Yeah, I have a comment.
Yeah.
I think that sign, that the token, that the whole family of people and animals in the earth, he will never flood again. God has given us the token of the Holy Spirit, showing us that we will live forever. That just connected in my mind that's the sign that the Holy Spirit in us, that we have eternal life. That's great. Thank you, Doug.
Yes.
I have a comment too, and I think that's why the adversary has changed the meaning of the word, because he's always attacking everything that has us remembering God, that the rainbow covenant for gay people. I just think that word, gay, all the words that have been attacked and changed to mean something else, takes away from us remembering what the rainbow covenant really is. I don't know, just saying, that just flew into my head while we were talking about it.
Very good. Okay, well, I've been going on a while. We can stop here and pick it up next month, or we can do the priestly covenant, whatever you want to do.
Why don't you do another one next week, and then you can pause for a few weeks. You know what I mean? Because you just kind of gave us and I'm just throwing this out there. I'm not saying everybody can agree or disagree with me. Maybe do one, because you just kind of gave us the basics of, this is what a covenant is. Why don't maybe you cover one type of this, if you're ready, next week, and then wait a month before you teach again, because I'd like to hear more.
Well, I'm only prepared to do the priestly covenant, which would only take about 10 or 15 minutes. And so the next covenant is the Abrahamic covenant, which I haven't really started on yet to try to put that together. So it'd be hard for me only to do 10 or 15 minutes.
Do you want to try for 2 weeks? Take next week and then come back and try to work the Abrahamic covenant and the priestly covenant?
I'd rather have about 3 or 4 weeks.
Sure. Okay.
Sandy will attest to I become a zombie when I'm doing it.
No, that'll fine. We'll just continue on as planned, I think.
Okay.
Yep.
So we'll pick it up then whenever I come back.
Yep. And that'll be, we can shoot for 3 to 4 weeks. We can figure out that date exactly.
Okay.
But thank you for teaching today, Doug. There were a couple times where Emily and I looked at each other and just went, ah.
Yeah, because this is a section